my own philosophy of sex, namely the philosophy that I used to have and BC, before conversion, or before Christ, either way. And then I'll talk about the philosophy that I have now and how I got to be that way. What happened to take me from BC into what non-Catholics might, some non-Catholics, not all thankfully, might think would be a life living, back in the Stone Age or something, or back at least in the Dark Ages when people cared about things such as chastity. First, just to give you an idea of what I was like BC, what was my philosophy of sex, I can tell you it was sexual atheism. That was my philosophy until I had my conversion at age 31 in October 1999, which now makes me anyway. Anyway, see, if I can't get a laugh with the joke, I can at least get a delayed laugh with my own laugh. This is good. And so, okay, thank you. So, BC, I was born into a Jewish household. I became an agnostic as a teenager. I'm going to tell you a little more about that in a bit when I talk about my faith journey. But I went to NYU. I was a rock journalist for many years through the 1990s, writing for The Village Voice, the English music magazine Mojo, Billboard magazine, Salon.com, and really living and believing in what I would now call sexual atheism. So to give you an idea of what that was like, I took 4 articles from today's New York Times, and I thought I'd tell you what the sexual atheist me would have thought of these. The first of these articles is a little news item: Hillary Clinton backs same-sex marriage. It is the tiniest article in the whole paper, apparently showing that this is not really news. But it says that Hillary said that gay rights are human rights, and she said, "I believe America is at its best when we champion the freedom and dignity of every human being." And I have to say, the old me, the old sexual atheism philosophy of sex, Dawn, would have agreed gay rights are human rights, and would have also agreed that America is at its best when we champion the freedom and dignity of every human being. And in fact, as you'll hear, the post-conversion me would agree with those statements as well, but just not quite in the same way. The second story is the headline, "Lawyers Shifted Role Amid Gay Marriage Ban." It's about a city official in San Francisco who, after same-sex marriage was banned in that state, led the legal effort that's now hit the Supreme Court to overturn the ban. And the article, it's well worth reading. It raises some very interesting questions on the role of city officials, whether they should be actively battling the law that they were hired or elected to enforce. And there are a couple of quotes here from this official who's the head of this effort to overturn, who's basically spearheading this lawsuit to overturn the same-sex marriage ban. And it says, Mr. Herrera said it was sometimes necessary for government lawyers to attack the laws they are charged with defending. Quote, "When a disfavored minority is being targeted," he said, "it's up to a public law office to stop it." Again, I would have seen no problem with that as a sexual atheist. I would have said, moreover, that, as Martin Luther King said, an unjust law is no law at all. What I wouldn't have known was that King was quoting Thomas Aquinas. Here's another headline: "Abortion doctor goes on trial for murder." And it's about the trial of Kermit Gosnell. doctor in Philadelphia who is currently on trial on 7 counts of murder for killing what the paper calls viable fetuses, which is a little strange because once a baby is born, it's no longer a fetus. I mean, that's just that's a technical, term. But the story is that these women came in for abortions. The babies were born alive, and this doctor is accused of killing these 7 babies by plunging scissors into their necks and, quote, snipping their spinal cords. So I can tell you right now that the pre-conversion me would not have read this article. I would have seen the headline, abortion doctor goes on trial for murder, and I would have skipped right over. And the reason why was because I did not want to have to think about abortion. I did not want to have to think about the morality of abortion. All I knew was that I had a right to express myself sexually, and this sexual expression, as I understood it, included, for my own personal flourishing and finding love, included being able to have sex with whomever I wanted. I did hope for marriage. That was my goal. But I knew that in order to seek love through sex, that I was at risk for pregnancy. And I knew that if I were ever pregnant, I would get an abortion. Thankfully, that choice was never one that I had to make, but there was no question in my mind that would have been my choice. And beyond that, I did not think it through at all. I just thought abortion's there when I need it, and that's all I need to know. I don't need to know anything about the gory details, or even think that or even try to imagine what those details might be. And the last story is from the editorial page. These are all from today's paper. A young man with Down syndrome, a fatal encounter, and a cry for understanding. This is a story about a 26-year-old man with Down syndrome who was taken to a cinema by his caregiver, and they saw Zero Dark 30, and then after the film, the caregiver went to get the car, and meanwhile, this young man went back into the cinema to watch the film again, and the staff told him he had to buy a ticket or leave. He refused. Sheriff's deputies came. They put handcuffs on him. He was crying, "I want my mommy," very clearly mentally disabled, and somehow he was on the floor and he died. And there are a couple of lines in this story that jumped out at me. One is from the blog of a group called Down Syndrome Uprising, parents who are parents of Down's children. And this mother blogging says, "This violence is a symptom of how we view people who are different from us." And the other line is from the reporter who says, it's easy to see the truth in that mother's observation. In a society that values equality, intellectual differences remain a barrier to acceptance. People with mental disabilities see it all: dismissal, contempt, affectionate pity. People look into the rounded face and unguarded gaze of someone with extra chromosomes and see a stereotype, a child who is lovable, adorable, maybe a little stubborn. What they do not see is an individual or an equal. So if I had read that in my sexual atheism days, I would have agreed with that angry mother. I would have agreed with the reporter, and I still do. But as to the first story, Hillary Clinton, gay rights are human rights. I believe that too. I mean, if you're saying people with same-sex attraction are human beings, that they, as human beings, are deserving of human rights, absolutely. if you're saying that they deserve to love whomever they wish to love, absolutely. Love is a gift from God, and it's meant to be shared. With regard to Hillary Clinton saying, "I believe America is at its best when we champion the freedom and dignity of every human being," that's what America stands for. What I do not read, as I think Hillary Clinton would read these statements, is that when she says gay rights are human rights, she's saying that therefore, if you don't allow people with same-sex attraction to marry people of the same sex, then you're denying them a fundamental human right. That's what I disagree with, because it's a human right to love. It's not a human right to biologically have a child with someone of the same sex. It's a human impossibility. And the institution of marriage exists only to protect children. There are children's rights, and these children's rights are values that society has, until the present day, always held paramount with regard to marriage, that it's about children and the well-being of children, and not about decisions, adult decisions with regard to simply seeking social sanction for love. With regard to the quote from Hillary, "I believe America is at its best when we champion the freedom and dignity of every human being." Again, I think that's true. I also think that when we consider freedom and dignity of every human being, we have to wonder whether we would want to live in a society of porcupines, where everyone's exercise of what they believe to be their rights infringes with everyone else's rights. I personally don't want to live in a society of porcupines, and so when I think of freedom and dignity, I think of the freedom and dignity of children. And there are very personal reasons why that's a sensitive issue to me, as I'll explain. With regard to lawyers' shifted role amid gay marriage ban, Mr. Herrera said it was sometimes necessary for government lawyers to attack the laws they are charged with defending. Quote, "When a disfavored minority is being targeted," he said, "it's up to a public law office to stop it." Well, the whole legal issue about whether government lawyers should be attacking the laws that they're set to defend is one thing. But with regard to the larger issue about when a disfavored minority is being targeted, it's up to a public law office to stop it. I certainly believe that that's true, and I can only say that I would give Mr. Herrera a bit more credence if he included unborn children in disfavored minority, status. Unborn children are the most disfavored minority in the entire country. They've been disfavored to the tune of, I think, about 55 million since Roe versus Wade. So, if we want to have a dialogue about it, then that's something that we need to include in the dialogue that I don't see included among the people who say that people of the same sex not being allowed to have the social sanction of marriage to marry others of the same sex are a disfavored minority. I think that we need to value the right to life in order to truly understand what the right to liberty is. Abortion doctor goes on trial for murder. Well, you can guess how I feel about that. But I can certainly tell you that the part that I would have really ignored with regard to this article years ago is not just the gory details, but the very last item in the article says, Rebutting prosecution claims that Dr. Gosnell was profiting from the desperation of poor women, Mr. McMahon said his client had passed up lucrative positions in obstetrics and gynecology so that he could provide an essential service in West Philadelphia, where he performed more than 16,000 abortions over 31 years. Now, I think that there are good people in this audience who may believe that it is truly loving and truly just to permit abortion, and yet I think that very many of these people would have a hard time actually envisioning a doctor performing a single abortion, let alone even trying to envision the enormity of a doctor performing 16,000 abortions over 31 years, a doctor whose vocation, according to the Hippocratic Oath, is to heal and not to kill. So that's certainly something I noticed about this article that I would not have even been able to consider years ago. And the last story about the Down syndrome parents. This violence, said the mother, is a symptom of how we view people who are different from us. And the quote from the reporter about the killing of this, which was ruled a homicide by the medical examiner. The quote from the reporter saying that in a society that values equality, intellectual differences remain a barrier to acceptance. People look at a Down syndrome person, what they do not see as an individual or an equal. This is a great article, and I'm very thankful that it appeared in the New York Times. And as I said, my feelings reading it are much the same as they would have been back when I was a sexual atheist. I think any good person reading this, any open-hearted person would really feel for the plight of Down syndrome people who are exposed to this. But I have to say that what I notice now that I didn't notice before is a real disconnect, a mental disconnect. Because on the one hand, we have a paper, the New York Times, which, even though it is covering the abortion doctor story, which as well it should, is on the whole, in terms of its editorial position, very much in favor of abortion rights. And then we have this sensitive article saying that this violence is a symptom of how we view people who are different from us. The abortion rate right now for children who are diagnosed in the womb with Down syndrome is well over 90%. I think it's over 95% and getting higher. So the mental disconnect comes when, on the one hand, we say that it is a woman's decision whether or not to bear a child who has a mental disability. And then we say, well, if someone actually has a child like that come into the world, then you can't treat that child with violence. You know, I would say that this man who was killed, Ethan Saylor, was as human at 1 week of gestation, as human at 6 months of gestation, as human at the age when Kermit Gosnell could have legally killed him. For Gosnell, it was all the way up to the 24th week, although he went beyond that. But actually, in the United States, there are places where it is perfectly legal to kill an unborn child up until birth. So I really question the disconnect that enables people to have one attitude in one part of the paper and another attitude in the other. I think that everyone should have the same right to life. So the rest of this talk, just about 20 minutes, is me talking about how I got there from sexual atheism to where I am now, how I got here. And it came from an encounter with Christ, and an encounter with Christ that came after some youthful suffering. In a lot of ways, my life was not as hard growing up as many people. I was born into a reasonably well-off middle-class or upper middle-class household. I knew my grandparents. Many kids today don't even know their grandparents. My parents did not have a high-conflict marriage. And all these things work in my favor for mental health. But my parents did divorce when I was 5. My sister and I were raised by our mother, and it was at that time that I ceased to be protected by my mother. I suffered sexual abuse. As you may know, the numbers are quite high among people who report having had childhood sexual abuse. 1 out of 4 adult women and 1 out of 6 men report it. But I suspect the numbers are actually much higher because those numbers only include what's known as contact sexual abuse. There is also non-contact sexual abuse. Non-contact sexual abuse includes being exposed to pornography, adult nudity, and graphic sex talk. Any one of these things can have lasting toxic effects, particularly when inflicted upon a young child. I suffered both the contact kind and the non-contact kind. My first abuse occurred when I was abused by an adult man outside the home. When I told my mother about it, she said, "You let him do that to you." I was 5 years old. Later on, the abuse took place at home. On a few occasions that I can remember, I was molested by one of my mother's boyfriends in my mother's presence. But more than that, throughout my childhood, my mother's home was what I would call a sexually porous environment. I don't recall any clear boundaries. I was not shielded from adults' nudity, substance abuse, and sex talk. And more than that, my mother did not recognize the most fundamental boundaries between her identity and my own identity. As a result, from early childhood, I became psychologically enmeshed with my mother in a manner that was profoundly unhealthy. Now, without boundaries, without protection for my personal identity, without protection for my personal modesty, I was unable to develop my identity. And I believe that the greatest wound caused by childhood sexual abuse is this wound to the child's identity. John Paul II, in his letter to families, talked about how children need to develop their identity in an environment of truth and love. You can't do that if you are subjected to lies and what John Paul called the opposite of love, that is, being treated as an object. Child sex abuse thrives upon lies. The abuser lies to the victim, while the victim, in turn, trying to cope with her wounds, often finds herself living a lie. Being abused caused me to develop an identity that was founded not on God's truth, but on the lies of my abusers, the utilitarian lies that made me believe I had no value beyond my usefulness to others. Now, it's common in some, although certainly not all, victims of childhood sex abuse to take certain pathologies into their adult sexual behavior, such as what psychologists call dissociative behavior. In my case, by the time I was in my teens, becoming very conscious of my own sexuality and my own attraction to men, inside, I felt like a vulnerable, unprotected child. I had been treated by adults as an object, so I didn't have an understanding of my own value as a human being, let alone the infinite value I had in Christ. And so, as a college student at NYU particularly, believing that people were going to use me, I dissociated from my true identity and created a false self. I wore revealing clothes. I used sexually explicit language in everyday conversation. And I prided myself on being sexually aggressive. I figured that men were going to use me anyway, so I might at least have some control over how they did. But beneath the posturing remained the soul of a little girl desperate to be told she was valued not for what she did, but for who she was. And that was my inner life as I went through what became a vicious cycle of dead-end sexual relationships, seeking love and not knowing that you can't seek permanence through impermanence. The very nature of the sexual relationship, apart from the vowed commitment of marriage, is a nature where, on the one hand, you're letting someone have this physical intimacy, and if you don't have the emotional intimacy and trust to really have the security of knowing that this person has vowed himself or herself to you, then inside you're thinking, that voice, you can be replaced. In my case, it played into my dissociation so that I just put up more and more of a shell and became hard, and was very unhappy and suicidally depressed. And I might have continued in that way if it wasn't for that grace entered my life one day in the most unexpected way. It's just amazing that if we have the slightest openness to grace, then God will take advantage of that to introduce himself. And for me, I wasn't hanging out with Christians. So as a rock journalist, God had to reach me through a rock musician, someone I was interviewing, a member of a band called the Sugar Plastic, not a Christian band. And I thought I'd ask him a bright question. So I asked this singer, what was he reading these days? And he said he was reading G.K. Chesterton, The Man Who Was Thursday. Anyone here read Chesterton? Oh, good, I see a few hands. Well, then you know what I was in for. I had no idea. C.S. Lewis said of Chesterton that a man who wishes to remain a sound atheist cannot be too careful of his reading. There are traps everywhere. That's what C.S. Lewis said, because Chesterton converted him from his atheism. And so I didn't realize, I just thought, I'll pick up this book so that I can read it and impress this rock musician the next time he's in town by talking to him about it. I had no idea that I was really walking into a trap, because I picked up this book, The Man Who Was Thursday, a novel, and I realized pretty early on that Chesterton was Christian, but by then I was hooked by the plot. And I was particularly hooked by the fact that Chesterton was writing about rebellion. And I could really relate to that, because I imagined myself as this great rock and roll rebel. But Chesterton, as I read on, I realized he was contrasting what he considered the false rebellion with what he considered the true rebellion. For Chesterton, the false rebellion was the rebellion of the anarchist, the rebellion of the person who is just seeking to tear down. And the true rebellion for Chesterton is the rebellion of the one who's rebelling for something, rebelling for truth and for beauty against a world that's fallen into darkness. And I liked truth and beauty, and I wanted to side with Chesterton's true rebel. But I got uncomfortable because I saw where this was going. I mean, just as you can probably see where this talk is going. And I saw that Chesterton was telling me this thing which I thought was quite outrageous, that the true rebels are Christians. And I thought, that's impossible. Christians aren't rebels. Christians are this faceless, white bread, vanilla, amorphous, moral majority mass who rule the world. And I thought the only way that I could have my own identity, which was what I so desperately wanted, was to be against whatever Christians were for. Have any of you seen Star Trek: The Next Generation? Anyone know that? Can I see some hands? Good, good, good. Yeah, I knew there'd have to be some hands. Well, then if you've seen Star Trek: The Next Generation, you're familiar with the Borg. The Borg is this universal mind that controls all the beings on this planet. And the Borg's motto is, I think, prepare to be assimilated. That's what I thought Christianity was, just being assimilated. I gave this talk to a group of lawyers in California once, and one of them raised his hand and said, "You forgot the other half of the motto." Does anyone know what it is? Yes?
Resistance is futile.
That's right. Resistance is futile. I didn't know that. So I was fighting the Borg, but the Borg was after me like the proverbial hound of heaven. And I found myself at least wanting to read more Chesterton. Even if I couldn't really believe that there were any salty Christians. I mean, Chesterton lived 100 years ago. The world's changed since then. Christians have gotten boring. That was what I thought. But as I kept reading Chesterton, after 5 years of reading Chesterton, because I was or 4 years, because I was pretty resistant, I finally wanted to read what had inspired Chesterton. So I started reading the Psalms and the Gospels. Dangerous move. If you do not want to be converted, do not read the Psalms and the Gospels. Especially do not read Psalm 27 every day, as I started to do. And so one day, something happened. Up until then, as much as I'd wanted to believe the Bible was true, the words were just flat on a page. But one day I was moved in my heart to open the Bible to Romans 5:1, not knowing what I was going to find there. And what I found was, therefore, being justified by faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ. And as I read that, suddenly the words were not flat words on a page anymore. It was like, one of those movies where it goes from black and white into Technicolor, and the words jumped out at me and took on dimension. And instead of just being something that someone wrote down thousands of years ago, it became the voice of a person speaking to me who loved me. And whose child I was without even having realized it. And so I became a baby Christian, and I still wasn't going to become a Catholic, though. That took another 5 years. Because I thought, well, gosh, Christianity is if Christianity is the Borg, then Catholicism is really the Borg. So I was fighting that for a while, and just church shopping. But what had really caught me about that verse from Romans was peace. I wanted to know the peace of God. At that time, I didn't know it, but I was suffering from undiagnosed post-traumatic stress disorder from my childhood abuse. With my conversion, I no longer could be suicidally depressed because I knew that God cared about me. And like the singer Ethel Waters said, God don't make junk. So I couldn't think about hurting myself. But I still wasn't finding peace. I would go to church on Sunday, get worked up in the spirit, and then during the week, that peace of the spirit would start to evaporate. I'd feel anxious again, and so what drew me into the church ultimately was an encounter I had with a saint, which I will save for the Q&A because I want to leave time for the Q&A. But it was an encounter that I had through asking for a saint's intercession and feeling that intercession, that I felt peace, and I realized that the peace that I really wanted was the peace of the Sacred Heart of Jesus, and that in order to have that peace, I had to go to the very heart of Jesus, which is his real presence in every tabernacle of the world, of the church that he founded. And so I became Catholic, and I started to, I was received into the church 7 years ago, Easter Vigil, and I began to feel this peace, but I would still feel anxiety. And I thought, okay, I did everything right. I became a Christian, I became chaste. Gosh, I haven't even talked about chastity, but this talk is the philosophy of sex, so we're good. But anyway, no, seriously, I will talk about chastity in the Q&A. Ask me about chastity. But this is important, because in order for anyone to want to stop having sex when you in complete freedom could, as I could have, or as I could at any moment in complete freedom, for anyone to stop doing something that brings them pleasure, there has to be something better. And that better thing is realizing that I am a beloved daughter of the Heavenly Father, and that I'm a daughter in the Son, in Christ, and realizing that because of this love, I don't want to do anything that would separate me from that love. God's love is always there for me. But it's like the glass in between, where I can muddy up my side of the glass, and the sunshine, even if it keeps shining, is not going to reach me. And I learned that my own seeking love through sex was muddying up the glass, and that in fact, without even realizing it, because of wanting to be a good person and not realizing the moral disconnect, I was treating other people like objects, just the way that I was treated as a child. I was not thinking of their greater good. I was not thinking that the only proper response to someone is to love that person fully and completely, according to my state of life, whether single or married, and according to my relationship with that person, whether I'm a daughter or a sister or a friend, or whether I were a spouse. That's what chastity is. It's learning to love fully and completely in the manner that's appropriate to each state of life. And so, but just going back and to really wrap up with that final question, what happened after I'd done everything right, gotten chaste, gotten Catholic, and still felt anxiety, still felt the PTSD? What's wrong? Well, I went on a spiritual retreat. Has anyone here ever done Ignatian prayer or meditation? Yes, I see a few hands. Great. Well, I really recommend it. Our new Holy Father, Pope Francis, is a Jesuit. They were founded by St. Ignatius Loyola, and Ignatian spirituality is something that's very easily accessible to everyone. You don't have to be a mystic to have an encounter with God through Ignatian prayer that might be more intimate than other kinds of prayer that you may have tried. In my case, I went on an 8-day Ignatian retreat in 2010, and the answer came to me with regard to the peace that I was looking for when I was praying in front of the Tabernacle that was housing in the chapel, housing the Blessed Sacrament, which Catholics believe is the real presence of Christ. And I was doing what St. Ignatius says, which is to not necessarily expect any kind of vision, but just to be attentive to the things that come to you as you're praying and thinking about God, and ask God what He wants to show you through these things. And what came to me was an image of the Eucharist in the Tabernacle as being like the center of this great bicycle wheel, with rays like spokes going out to all the earth, taking up everyone and everything in its embrace, and bringing everything back to the center in the Eucharist. And as I thought about that, I realized something that I had not thought about. I had thought that all the time that I was the times that I was abused as a child, and the pain that I had as a very lost teenager and young adult, and the anxiety that I still felt from my PTSD was all really wasted pain in some sense. I knew as a Catholic I could offer it up, so to speak, make it part of my offering to God. But I still felt that somehow Christ was not in that pain. At least he certainly couldn't be in the pain of my past. He might be in my pain now, but not in the past pain. But what I realized with that image was that just as Christ is really present for me in the Eucharist, Christ is present as the theologians tell us, Christus passus, the Christ who suffered. It's the resurrected and glorified Christ that we receive in the Eucharist. And the glorified Christ, when he appeared to the disciples, still had his wounds. He chose to retain his wounds, only his wounds are now glorified. And so I realized that just as Christ in the Eucharist is the Christ who suffered, that when I am really present for him, I am the Don who suffered. What does the past mean anyway? The past does not really mean anything just as the past. It means something because we are today the product of our past. So just if Christ is coming to me now as, in some sense, the product of the things that he suffered, having always had the will to suffer for me, then here I am before him, the Christ who suffered, as the Don who suffered, and so all my past pain, in so much as it remains in me, if I'm really present for Christ, then the light from his glorified wounds can reach my wounds and purify them, so that my wounds no longer separate me from Christ, but actually serve to draw me closer to him. This is the great good news of our faith, and for anyone who's not a Christian, for anyone who doesn't understand or agree with the Church's teachings on same-sex marriage, I just want to tell you that the Church would not have lasted as long as it has, and we, despite our wonderful popes that we've had for the past many years, we had some pretty rotten people running the Church, and they could have easily run it into the ground if it weren't really the body of Christ on earth. So I just invite you to think about how people who do uphold the Church's teachings on marriage, sexuality, chastity, do it because they realize that they are greatly loved, and they want to live inside that love, and they want other people to live inside that love as well. Thank you so much, and God bless you.